I wanted to leave with a final message of hope and practicality. And so I wanted to finish out the series today, David, looking at sort of the most notable story in the life of David in his slaying of Goliath, which we've never, I don't think, directly spoken about here in the last 2.5 years or so. But I believe it's the small moments that define our lives. So often, like, we remember or we talk about, or even if you think back, you think about the bigger moments, the pivotal transitions. Maybe you're moving or when you get married or when you have a kid. Those are the things that we think about. But I really believe it's the daily decisions that we make each and every day that define what our life is to become. The legacy that each of us will leave won't be built on those big moments. It's built one day at a time, one decision at a time, one step at a time. And over the course of time, that legacy of faithfulness or not is built. And so it's the things that you do when no one is looking that ultimately shape your destiny. And so if you've been here for the past 2 weeks or if you've seen it online, we were talking about David, and we've been going over his backstory and sort of the humble beginning that David came from. He was a man of character and discipline, and so much so that the Bible calls him a man after God's own heart, whatever that may mean in your interpretation. And now, after patiently positioning himself through years of faithfulness during this process of preparation that God had him on, David's presented with a unique opportunity, sort of this grand stage or this moment that we all remember and hear about it. And in that moment, it's really too late to prepare. Like when you have an opportunity of that magnitude, of the magnitude of David and Goliath, something that unexpectedly and suddenly comes up, it's too late to prepare. If you haven't already done the groundwork, if you don't already have some habits in place or some patterns in your life, then when something like that comes up, you're not going to be able to respond in time to take advantage of it. Have you ever noticed that? Like sometimes opportunity just knocks in your life, and if you're not ready for it, if you're I'll use this inappropriate, slightly illustration. Bear with me. Occasionally, people will knock on my door at my house unexpectedly. And I guess I've probably been on the other end as a pastor of knocking on people's doors unexpectedly. So if that was you, I apologize. I try not to knock. But people will occasionally knock on the door at my house. But if I'm like in my house shorts, eating cereal on the couch, I am not going to answer the door, okay? So there are these opportunities that come upon you, and if you're not prepared for them, you just can't take them. And sometimes most of the time I assume it's like Jehovah's Witness or door-to-door salesman or something. But every once in a while I see the people leave, and I think, man, what if I missed something good? Like, what if they were going to, I don't know, what if it was a good opportunity? But chance favors the prepared. Chance favors the people who put in the groundwork day in, day out, because when opportunity strikes, you have to act. We're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I'm actually going to be reading like most of the chapter, so I don't even have the scriptures today. If you want to, in the Bible, you can follow me and check out the story, but it is going to be a lengthy story, and I thought it would be easier for you to just follow along with me, because this story is really rich and involved and detailed. It starts out in verse 1, the story of David and Goliath. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line to battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So these two armies are sort of camped out on opposite mountains, and there's a big valley between them where they would, at a certain point, proceed to war against each other, right? And it says, there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. How many of you guys know your biblical measurements? Anybody? Okay. I didn't know that either. I had to look it up. But 6 cubits in a span apparently translates to about 9 feet tall. So taller than pretty much the tallest basketball player you can imagine. And he had a helmet of bronze on his head which is very heavy, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. So that's going to be 200 pounds of armor there. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. So this is a big guy, 9 feet tall. 9 feet tall is probably like the height of my hand with the stage, because I'm very short. Okay, so he stands this tall, very imposing. He's wearing 200 pounds of armor alone, and he has a spear that just the arrow point of it weighs 25 pounds. Like, that's like being speared with a bowling ball. Can you imagine? A big bowling ball, not even the girly kind that I use. A very large bowling ball. And if he was to hurl that through a normal person, a person of my size, I imagine I would explode. And then on top of that, he has a guy in front of him, because he's sort of the big warrior and he doesn't have to carry his own shield. There's a guy probably like bigger than me carrying a full-length body shield in front of him in that. He's a big, a scary, an ominous guy. And the story goes on and says, he stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose for a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So this sounds like a good deal at first. The two armies are planning to go to war at each other, and suddenly the Philistine camp says, "You know what, we don't have to fight this whole army. There's no use everybody dying. We'll just do like one-on-one, man-on-man, your best guy against our best guy, and we'll save all the bloodshed, all the death, all the slaughter, just one-on-one. Let's do this." It sounds like a good deal, but from their perspective, the Philistine giant, Goliath, was so much bigger than anyone they had on their side. And so as they looked at him, yelling at them from his 9-foot stature, "Bring me your champion and we'll settle this right now," they were terrified. They were horrified. It sounded good, but they didn't want to die. And they didn't want to be the servants of the Philistines. And from their perspective, it looked like that was pretty much a done deal. How would they defeat this giant? Who could stand against Goliath? And the thing that's true in our lives is that when challenges come our way, oftentimes this is how we respond. When challenges come before us, when obstacles, you tend to focus on the problem. You tend to focus on the obstacle. You tend to, rather than looking around at different circumstances, you tend to focus on the giant. Whatever your problem might be, whatever your situation is, whatever that obstacle in your way is, they have a propensity to stir up fear and emotion within us. No matter what it is, no matter what your struggle, what your circumstances, the challenges cause us to be fearful and to focus on them. The thought of closing a church and moving into an uncertain future and what that looks like, it can be a scary thing. The thought of voting for any number of candidates wherever you might land, and such high stakes are on the line for the country, for our individual lives and whatever, it can be a scary thing. It's a lot of weight. It's a lot of responsibility. And life is full of those challenges, full of problems and obstacles that we all have to face. And so often, I think our default position is to focus on those challenges. Rather than to see a silver lining, we tend to focus on the negative. Some people more than others. How could you not? It's only natural. Goliath, he's so big and we're so small. What could we possibly do? It's interesting in context of this story. When David was anointed by Samuel, we looked at that in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Samuel saw his brother, and he said, "This must be the guy because he's big and he looks like a king." But in that moment, God said, "Man looks at the external, but I'm looking at the heart." Don't look at what you can see, because I'm looking so much deeper within. It's natural for us to look at giants and to be dismayed, but God shows time and time again through Scripture, through His Word, through stories like this, that sometimes we've got to lay down our natural way of thinking for a supernatural way of thinking. Like, our ways are down here, but God's ways are up here. And sometimes we've got to close our eyes to walk by faith. Man, we look at what we can see, but God says He looks at the heart. And His perspective is so much higher than ours. It's almost like, Goliath's perspective up here compared to us, except infinitely more contrasted. And the more we begin to align ourselves with God's perspective, the more we begin to see things from His point of view, from His vantage point, the more we begin to look beyond the surface and to try to see the heart of the matter, the more successful in life we tend to be. The story goes on, and skipping down to verse 19, it says, "Now Saul and they and all of the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out in the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went to greet his brothers. And as he talked to them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, came out of the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words as before. And David heard them." So David, he's the younger brother. He's back keeping sheep, and he would travel between keeping sheep and playing music for King Saul, if you remember also last week. And his father sent him to deliver some food to his brothers who were on the front of the battle lines. And David goes there. This is the first time he has heard anything about this situation, and immediately as he gets there, he hears this giant come out and mock the armies of God. Verse 24 says, "All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were very afraid. And the men of Israel said, 'Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him, and great riches will be given to him and his daughter, and he'll make his father's house free in Israel.' And David said to the men who stood by," say that again, basically. And they said, well, he's going to give him his daughter and riches and glory. And David said, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." Here it is again. The people, from their natural perspective, are so focused on Goliath. They're so focused on this giant, this problem before them, that they're terrified. They're frozen in fear. And did you notice David responds differently? What do you think changed about David in this moment? I think it's his perspective. For 40 days and 40 nights, the Philistine giant came out and he mocked the armies, and they heard it every day, and every day their reaction was to cower in fear. But David's here for the first time, and the first time hearing it, his reaction isn't to cower in fear. It isn't to be afraid of Goliath. His reaction is to, instead of looking at the challenge before him, to look at the opportunity. When they talk about Goliath, David, instead of being afraid, he says, well, what are they going to do for the guy who kills him? Like, this could be a good opportunity for career advancement. This could be a good opportunity to marry the king's daughter. He focuses on the positive. He focuses on the opportunity. And that changes everything for David. It's his perspective. Are you the type of person who sees challenges, or the type of person who sees opportunities? Because so often those two things are two sides of the same coin. Every challenge has with it the potential for opportunity. A change in a church is a change for you to maybe find a new group of people, or a new place, or a fresh start, or new friends, new family, new teaching and style that you might connect with. But it's also a challenge. Do you see the things that could go wrong, or the opportunities for things that could go right? Do you focus on the size of the giant before you, or are you more focused on the size of your God, like David? He managed to mentally flip the script. He managed to mentally change his perspective to that of God. And he says, you know what? Goliath is pretty big when you compare him to like me, but if you compare him to God, he's really small. God is way bigger. Verse 31, the story continues, and it says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail before him because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine and fight with him, for you're but a boy, and he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, and I went after it, and I struck it down and delivered it out of its mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard, and I struck him, and I killed him. Your servant David has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So here it is again. Saul is using his perspective to look at David and to assess him and say, it's not going to work, David. You're little, you're young, you can't do it. It's not going to happen. You can't possibly fight this giant. He was all sight and no faith. But David, he shoots back and he begins to tell him about his past victories. He begins to tell him about the ways that God has provided for him before. He says, I've never killed a giant, but I've killed a lion and I killed a bear. And I wasn't really qualified to kill either one of those, but God was with me. Each of these obstacles turned into opportunity because he leaned into God and trusted with him. And David, he said that God's past faithfulness in my life is going to prepare me for future success. Because I know God, he was with me then. He was with me with the lion. He was with me with the bear. And today, this giant, it's going to be no different. See, God is faithful. If you look back at your life, if you account your journey of faith, your journey with God, can you reach a time where you say that God is not faithful? Because I can't. God he's faithful and he's good. And your current challenges, your current obstacles, they don't negate the fact that God is faithful. They just open him up to proving himself faithful in new ways and in these new opportunities and in these new times. I've never closed a church before, but I know God is faithful. And I know that these challenges in your life, they're going to open up new opportunities. They're going to open up new doors. They're going to open up new ways for God to show himself and prove himself one more time, once again. And instead of forgetting the past like David, I would encourage you to use whatever good, whatever memories you have of God, whatever victories that you've had in Christ to fuel you into a greater future potential. Have you ever noticed there are no wasted opportunities with God? Like each of our seasons of life build on one another, and there are things we can learn from successes, from victories, from challenges, from failures even. If we'll allow God to redeem those moments of our life, he always uses it. He always brings it back around and brings purpose into it. It's all leading somewhere, and it all matters. Romans says that he's working all things together for the good of those who love him. Even your current struggle, it has purpose. Verse 38 says, then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go with these, for I haven't tried them. And he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistines. See, this message today, this passage today, could really be almost a series in its own. There's so much information. There's so much application. And then in looking at this, I just want to focus on for a second that God doesn't mass produce people. that each of us, the Bible will tell us, is handcrafted, uniquely appointed for a time, for a place, for a purpose. And your life won't look like mine. Your spiritual journey won't look like mine. They're going to be different. They're going to be unique. And that's something to be celebrated. Like, that is God's wisdom in action. If he would have worn Saul's armor to fight Goliath, we would never read about him. He would have been slaughtered. He would have been crushed. And it must have looked pretty silly from Saul's perspective to see David walking out to face this giant in hundreds of pounds of armor with only a staff and a sling and a few small stones. It must have looked a little crazy. And in light of that, I would encourage you, don't let other people dictate how you live your life. Don't let other people dictate who you want to vote for or what church you want to go to or what job or career you want to have. You can only live the life that God has given you. You can't wear Saul's armor. You can't wear anybody else's armor. And he has a plan for your life if you'll trust him and you'll follow him. You've just got to take care and do what you can do. Verse 41, and the Philistines moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he had disdain for him, for he was but a youth, and he was ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. That's pretty intimidating, especially if you were facing a giant with a 30-pound spear. I would be scared. But David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with the sword and the spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. This, like children's church, we always leave out the cool parts of the Bible, but they're never going to read about all of that. They're never going to hear that David threatened to give the bodies of his enemies to the ravens and the birds. Verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and he took out a stone, and he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank in to his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. Now David didn't have a sword, so what he did was he ran over and he stood over the Philistine and he took his sword and he drew it out of the giant's sheath and he killed him and he cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. But the men of Israel and Judah, they rose with a shout and they pursued them as far as they could because they suddenly had newfound confidence when David had killed their giant. See, at the end of the day, the battle is the Lord's. We all play a part, and we all serve him. We follow him. We do what it is that we think for a season or for a time as we devote ourselves to following him. But at the end of the day, God is in control. God is sovereign. And God is not in heaven wringing his hands because of any problem or obstacle or challenge that you might face or that we might face or that any individual church might face. At the end of the day, I'm not excited about closing the church, but I know that I've been faithful to what God has called me to do. I know that I served and I followed and I tried. And at the end of the day, I know that God is in charge, that God is faithful, that the battle is his, and that one moment or one event or one occurrence doesn't thwart the integrity of what God is doing or has done here. It just means that God is moving on and has a new plan, and there's a new day and there's new opportunities. I know that we've served well and that we've seen lives changed and that we've made an impact in this place. Despite all that we might see from our perspective, God is in control. He has a purpose. He has a plan. And the victory is his. And this is true for you too. Whatever challenges you face, whatever obstacles you might have before you, I pray today that you would move forward in them with confidence and boldness, knowing that we serve a God who's far bigger than any obstacle we could ever face, than any challenge we could ever come up against. And realistically, Jesus has already defeated the greatest challenge that any of us would ever face in sin and death when he died on the cross. Let's pray. God, this was a big story for a big occasion, for a big day in the life of a church, Jesus. I pray that today the words that I've spoken might resonate with hearts and minds, that your wisdom would transcend my flaws, God, that your wisdom would transcend this moment, this occasion, that you would speak through your word to our hearts in only the way that you can do, Jesus. I pray that each of us might leave this place inspired, encouraged, and motivated to be more like you, to be more of who you've called us to be and equipped us to be, Jesus. God, I pray today that you would give us your perspective. So many of us walk around looking at everything at eye level, worst case scenario, God, but we know that you are in heaven, that you're seated high on a throne. And when you look down, our problems are so small. I pray, God, that you would give us your perspective. May your glory in our lives always outshine the giants that we might face. May your past faithfulness always prepare us to tackle future giants. And God, may we rest in the fact that knowing you have handcrafted us, that you've created us, that there are no mistakes, that we're loved and called and shaped by a maker who has a plan and a purpose for each one. And at the end of the day, God, we rest knowing that the victory isn't in our feeble hands, but it's in the hands of one who's much greater, much more competent, much stronger, Jesus. We're encouraged by that. We love you and we thank you for who you are and for all that you've done. In your name I pray. Amen.